Thanks for coming back for the final video in this series on construction of my layout. After I'd finished the work that I showed you in part 4 of this video, I kind of hit the wall. A couple of reasons for that. I was mentally just a little bit tired of pushing hard on the layout, but also, except for the scenery, ground level scenery that I had done in the earlier parts of the video and putting up the plaster shell for the hills at each end, I'd really never tackled rock faces and that kind of scenery. So I really needed to take a breath and learn how to do it. That hill you were looking at was built to cover a staging track with incredibly tight radius for the short local freight that brings cars out to service the industrial spurs there. Here it is from behind the backdrop, going through that very tight curve, which broadens out to about 19 inches as you come out into the visible part. I had put glued felt down on the upper part of the hill where there will be vegetation, but the rest there will be rock face, and I got a lot of help from a video by the great Dave Frary, who's been around a long time doing layout scenery, and I'll post the title of that video in a little bit. The end of the backup track there and the wires and so forth I wanted to cover with structures, not scenery, so an old structure I got at a train show, some flats. Now we're creating a little industrial area here all together, and the freight house and so forth. So we're going to have to put pavement in. First thing though, after measuring everything, get that track tacked down, and then I'm just going to glue it, which it's being held down with paint cans, mask off the factory, mask off all of the boundaries of the pavement, and there's even a little grade crossing right there. It was a nice part of the scene as it turned out. Mask everything off so that when you do put the plaster on, which I mixed slightly too weak, but it worked out okay. It just took longer to dry and to set up. But before it did dry, I have to pull off all the masking there, and we're creating a little perimeter for some weeds and foliage and so forth. And they're still needing to be shop vac is the spot for the factory, and wow, is that dark brown, that plaster. I was a little concerned it would stay that way. I hoped it would gray up a bit once it dried. And that plaster sunk between the rails there, so I was going to have to put a little bit more. There's a bit of a parking lot there. And it is starting to gray up just a little bit as it starts to dry. So there's a spot for the truck ramp. Put some plastic wheels in there to just cut the grooves, and then ran some metal ones. And it was nice and free. So we're good so far. And there's our grade crossing with a little bit more plaster in between the rails. Had to clear everything out, clean the rail tops again. And I poked that with my finger by mistake, but I just thought, hey, looks pretty good. Let's glue it in that way as broken asphalt. Put in a few weeds and so forth. The guide was to make this all as ugly as possible, and I certainly succeeded at that. That's not hard to do. Was running very low on ballast, and I still had about 4 to 5 feet of track here and at the other end to put in, and I just didn't want to run out and get another bag just to have a couple teaspoonfuls, so I really stretched the ballast the best I could, mix it with some other scenic materials and so forth, weeds, and yeah, it starts to go every which way. The more you work with it, the more it scatters. It's like herding cats. And here we go, just tidying things up a little bit. Put in some weeds. Now we're getting there a little bit. Spray on the glue solution. Clean the rail tops. The usual drill. This all has to dry for quite a while. And now I couldn't avoid it anymore. It was time to start on the rock face. So I'd watched the Dave Frary video, figured I could do it, Mask off what you don't want to get the plaster on. Boy, those cookies were good, but now we're making plaster, and with a mask is very helpful with the dust going everywhere when you pour the plaster. Mixed it a little thicker this time and just slathered it on there with a spatula. Pull that masking off. Yeah. You just do it in stages because it's going to set up pretty quickly. So the first stretch that I did, this is part of the Frary technique, and there is your YouTube site, and I think I put the name of the actual video in there too. Yeah, it's a good one. Cut some cross grooves. This is all pretty inaccurate at first, but then it sets up for another 15 or 20 minutes, and then you either use a brush or some, I did some fabric to wipe that off, and it still has to dry, and it's a dramatic difference. I was stunned when I saw what it looked like when it had dried. You can kind of see it drying here. And then that is an ancient box that I dug out of somewhere of scenic stone. Wanted to have a little talus, the rock that falls from. That's a good pour. It's all in the wrist. Get everything corralled there, put some weeds in. The good thing is if you mess up the scenery, you can always just put some more on top. So that was enough to be moving ahead with. That's all drying. And that's our scene. And as you can see, the rock face took really, I would say, 24 to 36 hours to really dry, and it's still pretty dark here the day that I did it. Followed the same procedure all the way down at the right end of the table where the coal power plant is. It's going to hide the coal dumper. Started messing around with a little extension to the rock face. So now we're back on the left-hand tunnel and decided to use hairspray instead of taking forever to spray the glue solution on. And the nice thing is that you don't have to cover all of these seams on the first pass. You just kind of work your way through, you add various, you want to cover them pretty well on the first pass, but then you're going to start adding in, or I did anyway, add in various colors of scenic powder. The nice thing too is that the more you do this, the less that looks like brown felt and the more it starts to look like earth. Just feeling my way along here, add in various colors, press that in, try to cover those seams in the felt. And it's all pretty wet here. Takes a long time to dry. Put in a lighter color, and all of a sudden, it looks kind of like California hills, near the desert. So didn't want quite that stark a color, but the spraying actually helped because it moves some of this around and makes blurred the lines a little bit. And then some of it fell down where I wanted it to be anyway on the rock face for some vegetation. So here it is right after quite a few coats with the window wide open and wearing a mask for the hairspray. And I'd have to see tomorrow what it looked like when it dried. I started messing around trying to make some trees from natural garden plants. These are called yarrow, a friend of mine told me, and they look somewhat like the trunks of trees. You have to clean a lot of chaff off of there, including the dead petals or flowers there. And then you dip it in a weak glue solution and put on some commercial foliage with mixed results. First time I'd really tried it with any application. The green is a little bit too stark color, but at least I got a feel for how those would look on the hillside. You can always change that color with a little bit of extra scenery powder, and that's what I do later. Sometimes when you look at the little bit that seems it's left to be done on a layout, you figure, yeah, I can knock that off in a couple of days, and it just goes on and on. So at this point, I just wanted to get the basic scenery down, and this was a fun part to put a little rock face here. Again, using the Dave Frary technique and having masked it off before, once this dried and peeled off very nicely. The styrofoam and the board below would be covered later by probably black fascia. And there is our little rock face. I kept some of the scenery powder from going over the edge onto the floor with a little barrier there. That was just the beginning of it. And at this point, I'm not going to show you every other detail that was done. It was time to start getting it ready to kind of finish up. Kinds of glue and hairspray had been all over these rails on the upper level, so I used that little notched screwdriver as my railhead cleaning tool, vacuumed all that stuff up. You have to meticulously test everything to make sure it still runs. Of course, a layout is never really finished, but looking ahead, lots of details to keep putting in. A fascia would be added in the front here to cover the bare look, and that truck tunnel finished, buildings weathered, that coal dumper behind there just been painted, and that needs to be weathered. By the way, I didn't mention that I temporarily covered the pegboard with some white paper just so it would look a little bit more like, I guess, an overcast sky. That rock face extension, still don't know if it's going to last. These trees were old efforts, soon to be discarded. The tracks I really wanted to look like the worst examples of 1960s, 70s bankrupt railroad deferred maintenance, lots of bad track spots and places where the engines and cars would lurch around, which is tricky to do without also derailing, but I had some fun with that. I'd put in that small rock face. It's kind of a placeholder right now. I'm not sure if I want to have just a solid wall of buildings across the back where there is very little space, but this industrial area turned out pretty well like I hoped, with some flats and some standalone buildings, the bridge and so forth. Now trees, I was going to have to do dozens of these, and it's winter now, so you have to do those outside. It's so messy, it's unbelievable, and I'm going to have to do those in a couple of months when there's some nice spring and summer weather. So there's our main line, there is our upper level, and it's about time to take a little modest test run. So I'll leave you with the best part, running some trains on the newly finished part. More videos to come, of course, and many details and improvements to add continuously as time goes by. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to this channel, and I will look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.